Brought to you by Pfizer.
In this video, you're going to see the future.
Hey, you Awakening Wonders. Thanks for joining me today for Stay Free with Russell Brand. Across the world, we are forced to question how electoral democracies are managed and what the function of democracy is now, how its mechanics operate. I'm asking that question, I suppose, on the basis that in two countries, you would have, I'm talking about France and the UK, clear victories for particular parties. In the case of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer's Labour Party, and in France, this extraordinary conglomeration of multi-layered alliance that has led for a victory for the French left. And there are aspects of that alliance that are pretty interesting. There are sort of anti-war components. There are some pretty awakened movements that emerged, I assume, from that Gilets jaunes moment in France. But what you're left with, I think, when you analyse the results as best as I can using my mind and this pen, you're left with the idea that potentially the results are not all they initially seem. Nevertheless, here is a bit of celebratory footage of the people of France. Some pretty good-looking people, but one person who's clearly been selected because of his potentially antagonistic resemblance to Che Guevara. This is footage from Rebel News. Sync on the floor, or audio on the floor, if you don't mind, guys. Hello there. This is Russell.
On est trop fort à gauche, on a l'amour, on a la fête, on a la joie, vous avez la haine, on est trop fort, on est trop fort. Vous avez perdu, désolé. Et c'est des racistes. Voilà, c'est tout. On va aller se faire enculer. C'est tout, c'est tout. Vous avez perdu. Vous avez perdu. Vous avez perdu. Alors, vous avez le démon. On va rester en France. Nous les Boudoulous restent ici. On reste ici. Voilà, on va rester là, les gars.
There you go. Being against racism, of course, is a very, very good thing. Good to not be racist. But are we sure that we understand precisely what's taken place in France? I'm not sure that I understand, of course. But what I do know is that Macron is still and will remain president, and that 200 candidates dropped out of the race in an attempt to, a successful attempt, to strategize and tactically beat the Rally National, they're usually called the far-right participants. So, listen, let's have a little look at that. Yeah, that's right, mate. Let's have a look at this. Because what's interesting about this alliance is that some of the parties are like environmental, some of them are far left. There's like 9 communists, actual old school communists. And the guy that's most prominent at the moment, the person they're going to have to bury, I think. What's he called? Mélenchon, I think is his name. This dude they're going to have to bury because he's going to be a massive pain in the arse. Now, first we'll look at this. We'll look at the results of the French election, the way that these results were achieved, and we'll compare it to the UK election and how those results were achieved. It's much more institutional in our country. The UK proportional representation favours the 2 major parties, but in France there's been some extraordinary sort of in real time gerrymandering, deals being done, people dropping out of the race in order to prevent the far right, who did receive the majority of the votes from achieving the ascendancy that seemed likely. Now, I wonder if ultimately there will be a mandate for the kind of people that are celebrating, who appear to be, on the basis of this, anti-racist and anti-war. And I reckon we're all anti-racist and anti-war, aren't we? If you're watching us on YouTube, we'll be there for about another 15 minutes. Then we'll be streaming exclusively on Rumble. And to those awakened wonders, let me know what you thought of my 5 favorite things that I just can't live without. I'm going to show you a little bit of that in a minute. It's a delightful little conglomerate. Here's some analysis now so we can look at what this new composition that makes up the French government is in fact made up of. All four parties said they'd made concessions. The NFP, that's the new alliance, program is heavily influenced, or the sort of largest part of it, influenced by that of the radical left LFI, including pledges that would significantly increase France's already high public spending. It promises to reverse Emmanuel Macron's controversial changes to pensions and return the retirement age to its pre-2010 level of 60, raise public sector wages, link salaries to inflation, boost housing and youth benefit, cut income tax and social security for low earners, and introduce a wealth tax for the rich. All pretty good ideas so far, you would think, wouldn't you? Pretty good. So listen to this. NFP also aims to raise the minimum wage, fine, fund 500,000 childcare places, why not, cap prices for essential foods, electricity, gas and petrol, boost green measures, including legislating for carbon neutrality by 2050, and overhaul the EU's common agriculture policy. You know how controversial agricultural policy, particularly coming out of the EU, has been in the last 5-10 years. And of course, carbon neutrality is an idea that's spoken about and causes a lot of controversy in this space. What I'd be interested in is if the measures spoken of here, most notably the environmental ones, will lead to restrictions and legislation on individual freedom rather than the, for example, tempering and controlling the profits and activities of international global corporations, including and most obviously energy corporations. On foreign affairs, the alliance has said it would demand an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. What do you reckon to that in the chat? Recognize Palestine. Okay. Halt Moscow's war of aggression in Ukraine. Keep supplying arms to Kiev and unfailingly defend the sovereignty and freedom of the Ukrainian people. But the dude that's Mélenchon, not Mélenchon, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's currently the leader of the LFI, the largest part of one aspect of this alliance, because the alliance is Macron's bunch, this little bunch called the NFP, which itself is made up of a cluster of organisations, meaning that France is likely to be pretty unstable, and doubly unstable, I suppose, because the whole conglomeration has been put together to prevent the ascent of the right. That was the sort of function of it. But then you wonder where all of that energy goes. It's it's comparable to what will happen in the UK when Reform have 800,000 people behind every seat in Parliament. They've got 5 seats in Parliament. And Labour have 30,000 people behind every seat in Parliament. And Nigel Farage has come right out of the block saying immigration is going to be the issue that I'm going to fight on. It's always the issue that Nigel Farage fights on. How will Starmer deal with that? How will these victories ultimately for centrists, although many people have pointed out, how are they victories for centrists if they've had to form alliances with parties and groups of the left, ? How will they govern from what seems to be a precarious position? It's pretty interesting because in the sort of cooperative that's been formed here, for example, there are a variety of views on pretty significant issues, for example, Gaza. And I wonder how they're going to manage this in government. It's going to be pretty interesting, I would think, and will likely lead to fissures and maybe even chaos. There's been a lot of instability in France. In fact, this snap election was an attempt to mitigate control and bring down that chaos. Same in the UK, because why did the Conservative Party call an election that it was inevitable that they were going to lose and significantly lose? Presumably, it's part of an overall agenda to maintain some semblance of control. And the more cynical among you would say, would simply cite the Who's song, Meet the New Boss, same as the old boss. Indeed, I think that's what PJW did on his video analysing it. So, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, 72. Did you like the French accent? It's a pretty good attempt at it, I thought, and I don't think I overdid it. I didn't go like Mélenchon. I didn't try to make it like overly sexy. Had promised to take a back seat. This guy, I think, is going to be funny. Keep your eye on this guy. Had promised to take a back seat in the NFP, but has been unable to do so, demanding on Sunday that France's next Prime Minister come from the alliance and implement our manifesto and only our manifesto. Power's got near him. The elixir of power. It turns people crazy. People, when managing the business of politics, people make whatever compromises they have to make. That's why you've heard Keir Starmer say, I'd never work with the Sun. I'm working with the Sun. I prefer Davos to Westminster. People will drop whatever they need to drop drop, acquire whatever they need to acquire to get into power, and then people change. Once it's extraordinary power, it's mercurial magic is unleashed on the mind. People start, because I suppose, maybe because there aren't sufficient virtues and principles that are beyond the remit of selfhood that ultimately motivate people. Maybe that's why we get in trouble. What I'm saying, not to be opaque, is if all of us were dedicated to a project of salvation and redemption, if all of us were individually contributing to the common good, although I recognise there are people in the world that are doing that naturally, and not all of them are Christian, I'm not suggesting that for a second, then we would have different systems, wouldn't we, representative of a higher set of values. We're going to see a chaotic period in France. We're going to see a chaotic period in the UK because there are these escalating wars. There is the necessity to implement further and further authoritarianism, more and more censorship, because otherwise what's happening in France, this fragmentation and fracture, would happen everywhere. You can't achieve consensus. You can't achieve cohesive and continual control of a narrative because, you know, as that book said, here comes everyone. We're all piping up from the sidelines. That's not true. Keir Starmer didn't support Assange when he was in opposition. Why not? When he was head of the CPS, why was he not looking for ways to get Assange out of Belmarsh? We can all see that. Hey, we've got footage of Keir Starmer saying, you know, they can't maintain control in the good old days of CNN and BBC and centralised authority. The pre-communications miracle era meant that centralised control was plausible. It's not plausible anymore. Back to Jean-Luc Mélenchon. He's even suggested he'd quite like the job himself, having said, look, I don't want any power. Now that the power's come near, like the ring's gotten him. He suggested he would quite like the job himself, but his frequent outbursts of rage, love that, petty attacks on opponents, he's petty, reflexive anti-US stance, Europhobia, and before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, frequent Moscow-friendly remarks have made him too toxic. So this dude, they're not going to be pushing for him. Mélenchon has also faced accusations of anti-Semitism, recently describing the attendees of a demonstration against anti-Semitism as the Friends of Unconditional support of the Gaza massacre, and appearing to minimise anti-Semitism in France by describing it as residual. He denies these accusations. Many of Mélenchon's fellow NFP, that's the new alliance that teamed up with Macron's crew to win this election, cannot stand him. They don't like the dude. Now remember that prior to Keir Starmer in the UK, the Labour Party was run by Jeremy Corbyn, and that guy had to be exorcised, booted out of the party along with any allies or even remnants of him. So now we've got the extraordinary situation where it seems to me a Corbyn-like politician, i.e. an old-school leftist, has ascended to a position of power and is having to make deals with the new sort of globalist WF types, of which Macron is one of the OGs. If there was a Klaus Schwab boy band, you better believe that Macron, next to Trudeau and now Starmer, would be front and centre, and the drool from Schwab's pouches, his significant hamster pouch cheeks, would be glazing them. They would be glazed in glory. Many of Mélenchon's fellow NFP members can't stand him, and LFI defectors who have abandoned the party over his bullying tactics. He's a bully, and they are now independent left-wing MPs. They talk of him as an obstacle to the left. So there you go. That's yeah, it's going to be tricky for that little bunch. And what's happening in... I suppose you'll want to see a little bit of analysis of what the centrists actually represent. But before that, I just want to show you how this is comparable to what is happening in the UK. Mostly what I mean by that is the phenomena of liberalism as authoritarianism. We'll head to that in a second, because the UK, similarly, even though on the surface of it, it's an out-and-out landslide. The Labour Party have got 411 or 12 seats, and the Tory party, their opponents have been decimated. On the surface of it, that seems to be the case, but with a little bit of analysis, we showed you this last week, you see that Reform got 4 million votes and only 4 seats, 5 eventually. Lib Dems got 3.4, I think it ended up being 3.7, and 69 seats, I think they ended up with 71 perhaps, and Labour won 2/3 of the seats with only 1/3 of the national vote. Now, the reason I'm interested in that is to show yet another disjunct between the electoral systems and the results of the elections. Now, in your country, the United States of America, there are quibbles and quarrels enough around voting machines and voter ID and mail-in votes. That what we're talking about here is the mechanic of democracy itself. And while we're all sort of trying to understand how these maneuvers take place. 200 French candidates dropping out, 80 from Macron's party, and 129, no, it's the reverse, isn't it, of this new alliance. They dropped out to make way for one another to ensure that they won tactically. I wonder what you think the ethics of that are, because that's not flat out representation of the will of the people. It might be necessary. It might be, you might even call it a necessary evil, the same way as accepting donations from corporations, from big pharma, from big tech, from the military. That's described as a necessary evil. But once you take on all these necessary evils, what you've necessarily gotten left with is evil. An evil system that can only mask its evilness through banality, not even through the pretense of good. Although perhaps a beautiful way to describe wokeness would be the pretense of good, because none of you surely are making an argument that we should be discriminating against people on the basis of race or their sexual preferences. Surely any awakened and enlightened person knows that our first duty is non-judgment. Surely we know that our ultimate duty is to live in a state of love. But the problem with wokeness is that it cannot live by the virtues it espouses. It uses them but as a veneer to mask the globalist corporatism that we're all describing. Otherwise, if you were truly woke, it was like, I believe in the rights of these religions or these minorities, or, you know, insert whatever idiom or synecdoche is required to complete that sentence, you wouldn't be pro-war, would you? You wouldn't be pro the jailing of Assange. You wouldn't be pro global institutions that do not respond to the electorate at all, like the WHO or the WEF or the World Bank or NATO. All of those things that are functionally giants now, giants among us, indefatigable, unbeatable entities that can't be controlled by ordinary people. A true leader would surely oppose those things. Now, you will know who your elected representative truly represents when you see them in action. And it seems that Keir Starmer, like Tony Blair before him, that uber globalist, is strongly affiliated to the globalist project that similarly has in its palm Emmanuel Macron, still the president of France, and I think he will remain for another couple of years at least.
Our country needs a bigger reset.
We need a great reset.
Are you surprised that your Prime Minister didn't show up to Davos?
Yes, I think our Prime Minister should have showed up at Davos. I absolutely do. And one of the things that's been...
Okay, Prime Minister that does show up to Davos.
Impressed on me since I've been here is the absence of the United Kingdom, and that's why it's really important that I'm here and that our Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves is here as a statement of intent that should there be a change of government, and I hope there will be.
Doesn't that sort of seem like a middle management mob figure showing up to pay tribute to the heads of the five families? You know, we're here to show you that when we're elected, we bloody well will come. And I'd invite you not to look at the backdrop and the 666 configuration that runs through the O's in the words World Economic Forum. Ah, the beast is risen and he's dull.
The United Kingdom will play its part on the global stage in a way I think it probably hasn't in recent years.
Play its part. The UK will play its part on the global stage. What does that mean? Does that mean to be the recipients of migrants? Does that mean to participate in wars? Does that mean to participate in the plunder of vulnerable nations? It seems to me a new consensus is emerging around the subject of migration, that most countries now want individual sovereignty, want the control of their borders, don't want to be involved in international wars, and are no longer willing to support globalist corporatist projects that rely on their flags and their names and their tax dollars, but enrich only an elite that stands ahead, above and beyond of all nations. Corporate elites that find ways of avoiding paying taxes, find ways of navigating the bureaucracies of nations that they use as to we can't avoid them bureaucracies, is basically what I'm saying. You try to avoid paying taxes.
What we are very proud of now, the young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, President of Argentina and so on, that we penetrate the cabinets.
Oh, they're penetrating the cabinets, baby. They've penetrated this cabinet.
Government will serve you. Country first, party second.
Davos or Westminster?
Davos.
There you have it, baby. He's a chip off the old block. But actually, let's do this Macron thing now. Have a look at this. So the idea of authoritarianism and liberalism ought be oxymoronic, authoritarianism being the opposite of liberty and therefore liberalism. But Emmanuel Macron, still president of France, maneuverer in elections, now stands as the most obvious example, and perhaps the most powerful example, of authoritarian liberalism. You can certainly make the case that in your country, the Democrats, while using recognizable rhetoric around the culture wars and pretending to be progressive, are similarly an authoritarian liberal movement. What I mean by that is, do they give you a choice as to whether or not there are going to be wars? Do they give you a real choice around the sovereignty of your nation's borders? Do they give you a real choice as to how to respond to health crises? Are these the kind of things that you were invited to participate in? Was there a set of referenda, I wonder? Well, this might help us to understand what is meant by the phrase authoritarian liberalism. It certainly helped me to understand it. The shift towards security is perhaps the most striking aspect of Macronism. How do you justify authority? We're protecting you. Why have we got to stay in our homes? We're protecting you. Why have you got to take these injections? Well, you have to take them because we're protecting you and your grandma. Have you done clinical trials? Stop asking questions. We're protecting you from the answers of those questions. Macron replaced liberty with security and made this the cornerstone of his regime. So remember, we saw those young people celebrating at the beginning of this section. What are those people celebrating really? They're celebrating rhetoric. They're celebrating idols. They're not celebrating policy because Macron's still in power and Macron is a globalist. Macron ain't going to do nothing to help those young people and their various ideals. Pretty soon they will be spilled and adrift in the streets of Paris, lost and bewildered, inadvertent flaneurs looking for something, going nowhere. That's sort of my prediction, because this kind of authoritarianism is anti-human. You don't want to be protected by the state. That's not the job of the state. Minimal protections, I'm sure, a little bit of regulation, not these kind of odd forays into idealism. He replaced liberty with security and made this the cornerstone of his regime. Even before COVID-19, Macron had securitized the French state against internal threats. Inheriting a state of emergency imposed by his predecessor, François Hollande, after the 2015 Paris attacks, Macron passed many emergency powers into ordinary law. Remember, that was the last version of this, to protect you from terror, or as George W. Bush used to call it, terror. Remember, he wouldn't pronounce all the syllables, would he? Not all of the vowels, just terror, like that. It was slightly like someone who had had a stroke trying to say it. It was terror that we were being protected from. It was terror that meant that we had to give the state access to private information. And remember that the Patriot Act that was passed in the aftermath of 9/11 is still operative. You are still spied on by your state. Why? Because they're protecting you. So Macron is merely one observable symptom of a global phenomena of authoritarianism that masks itself as liberalism. That's why it's significant. Okay, effectively, into ordinary law, effectively making the state of emergency permanent. Permanent emergency is another one of the themes of authoritarian liberalism. Those powers meant to curb the threat of terrorism were then used against the Gilets Jaunes, a social movement with a broader popular base and appeal. Now, you'd think that some of these left-wing parties that are part of this new alliance would have derived some of their support from the Gilets Jaunes movement. Remember those protests on the steps of BlackRock and Vanguard. They were anti-corporate. The French people were pissed off that they were having their pensions reduced and were being asked to work for additional years. They were having their sort of French culture altered before their eyes. I pray that you can look beyond what seems to be the most significant issue to most of you based on comments and stuff, the important issue of migration, immigration and cultural change. And notice too that you have won the argument on the subject of migration. The Labour Party, even parties from the left, everyone says, well, you have to at least pay lip service to the idea of border security and border control. That argument's been won, at least, at the level of the public dialectic, the public discourse. But who's carrying the argument for anti-globalism and global corporatism? And let me know in the chat. God, I'd actually love to know. What do you think is a bigger threat to your country? Immigration or the power of globalist elites? What do you think is going to affect your life? Now, of course, you'll be more directly aware of, bloody hell, wages are lower because of migration, can't get doctor's appointments because of migration. Those things will be more visceral, and there's no question that there are cultural issues that are arising in certain parts of Europe and, as I understand, America as a result of that. But where do you think real power is? And what do you think Macron, Biden, Starmer, even if this is not what they're doing at the level of their sort of subjective experience, whose interests do they work for? As Chomsky once said, if you didn't work for those interests, you wouldn't be sitting in that chair. By the time you've been through the law schools or the universities or whatever party political machinery they put you through, who knows what skullduggery, chicanery and blackmail Epstein Islandery you have to also pass through, the archipelago of sin that creates these creatures. By the time you get there, you better believe your interests and Vanguard's interests and BlackRock's interests and NATO's interests are pretty fucking tightly aligned, because otherwise you won't make it through the maze, right? So what's more important? Migration leads to globalism. It's a contributory factor in the ways that I've just listed. But remember, don't switch off. Don't switch off, you lot. Come on. Macron reinforced this security regime during COVID, giving prefects, state-appointed regional or departmental representatives, extraordinary powers, including the power to ban individuals from entire regions. I read that even Napoleon was not so tyrannical in his implementation of the use of those prefects. Excuse me. The securitization of French society culminated in a law against separatism, allowing for more state control over non-governmental organizations, including mosques, but also secular civil society associations. In a minute, right, I'm going to leave you there for a second. If you're watching us on YouTube, let's start the countdown. We're going to be exclusively available on YouTube, not on YouTube, bloody hell, those bastards, what they've done to us. Give their money back. Damn you, Dinage. Damn you, Caroline Dinage. She's the person that works for the Department of Cultural Affairs that wrote to all of the various social media sites and said, shut down, demonetize that dude. No, we'll be on Rumble, and we'll be talking about Biden's comeback tour. He's back, baby, and he's more demented than ever. We'll be showing his appearance on ABC, and we'll be breaking down globalism, and look who's come back from the tomb. Why, it's Tony Blair himself to support his new protege Keir Starmer. Click the link in the description. Get on over here.